Okay, we'll call the special meeting Committee of the Whole to order at 1:01 p.m. Ask for a motion from Councillor Cooey that the Committee of the Whole adopt the agenda for the special Committee of the Whole meeting November 24th, 2020 as presented.
I will give you that motion, Mayor Snodgrass.
Thank you. All in favor? Motion carries. And we're into the utility fund diversion discussion. So I'll hand it all over to Chris.
Perfect. I'll share my screen here of the presentation I circulated last week. Can everybody see that? So one, I want to thank Council for letting us bring this forward again and having the conversation about the utility fund diversion. We think it's an important conversation to have. And this year presents us with a unique opportunity to have a serious discussion about terminating the diversion at this point in time. So I want to stress today that there is no need for a decision to be made. We're here for providing you information. And we want to make sure that you get all the facts. It is a complex issue. It's not simple by any stretch of the imagination. And we've been working together to try and simplify it as much as possible to make it easy for council and the public to understand the process we're going forward with. The whole goal today is to just present the facts and present the opportunity that presents itself so that with the surplus that we're forecasting for 2020, and to see if there's a conversation that we should continue on having about how to cease the diversion. Today's agenda will kind of summarize our previous budget meetings a bit, some of the key assumptions, and go through that. We'll get into the detail of the utility fund diversion and a little bit of the background that I've been able to get from staff and from some of the research I've done, what the projected surplus is and where it's coming from, outline the utility revenue and expenses so you get a clear picture of that, and then outline the diversion proposal and what the potential tax scenarios may look like. Part of this package also talks about changing our reserve fund structure and how we use some of our reserve funds a bit, and then we'll talk about next steps and then open for questions and comments. At any point through this presentation, if you have a question, do not hesitate to interrupt me and anybody else that may be presenting from Leanna or Nicole or Riley and ask that question. We want to have a good conversation, good dialogue going back and forth on this issue so that we can move forward in a positive direction. So moving on, any concerns about that agenda that we've laid out? So the budget summary so far, we've presented you with a balanced budget, basically a revenue neutral approach using the 2020 revenue as a base. There's no increase in utility rates proposed. And you saw that yesterday with the rate and fee bylaw that there was no increase in utility rates. And any increase in taxes will need to reflect an increase in level of service or a new service that's being developed, increased funding to community groups, increased contributions to reserves, or a new capital project that we haven't projected out for 2021. This will also include the new initiatives that we'll discuss next week. We are seeing changes in assessment, and those will have an impact on the budget. Values have continued to decrease from 2020 to 2021, and that has a slight impact on the budget and tax implications from that perspective. On November 30th, we still have the last budget meeting with council and the committee of the whole structure, where we'll have a detailed conversation on the community group funding and a summary of that and allocate the funding appropriately. Take a look at the new initiatives that were included in the original budget package and allocate any funding if we're going to go forward with any of those. Do another deep dive and review of the capital plan. And now that we know that our first of grant flood mitigation projects has been approved for extension to 2022. How does that figure into the capital plan and what does that do to the work program and the workload of staff? And then the final discussion on the tax rates, including this utility diversion and how it may impact that. So that's kind of where we're at. We're still on track to meet a budget approval process of December. and be in an interim budget while we wait for some numbers from the province, or we go to an approved budget. We're dealing with that from that perspective, but we're still on track. And we got important discussions today and next week still to have. So some of the impact on the utility diversion I've been able to glean from staff and council. Chime in. You guys have been working through this for the last 3 or 4 years. What I've been able to determine, and from Riley and from Leanna, was that this started around 2009, 2010, and was kind of a way to continue funding projects and business cases to get some projects done. Haven't been able to track down a clear council directive or resolution to siphon the funds, and it just kind of continued to develop organically and evolved over time. And it was just a way to, in a blunt way, it was a form of indirect taxation to keep tax levels low by using utility revenue from that perspective. It has been integrated into operations to support increased levels of service. Tracing that back on which levels of service takes a lot of time, and we're not going to get into understanding exactly which levels of service that may have been directed to. And so we could spend some time on that, but that could be lots of hours of administrative time trying to track that down from that perspective. Principally wise, from a philosophy perspective, utility fees should be retained within their own segregated business units and independent from general operations. They should be self-funding entities on their own, and operate like a business unit independently. Any fees that are siphoned off need to be funding any directly attributable costs associated with administrative functions, be it utility billing or administrative functions of directors or managers or other staff. In the 2021 budget, we currently have $2.4 million being siphoned from utilities, with about $1 million being contributed to general capital of the SURF fund, and then $1.4 million being used to subsidize general operations. So that's a pretty big number, $1.4 million to subsidize general operations. And under normal circumstances, it'd be pretty daunting to try and figure out where to find that. And when you consider 1% tax increase as a $200,000 revenue increase, we'd have to be dealing with a 7% tax increase just to offset that cost. So that's a pretty significant jump in taxation, and we wouldn't be talking about it today if we didn't think we could do it with this surplus that we're seeing and how we can use that to our advantage for the future. Any questions on the background a bit, or anything to add from that perspective from members of council? Seeing nothing. I only see half of council, so anybody else that's not included, just chime in. So our 2020 forecasted surplus, we're forecasting approximately $5 million in 2020. Now, this could be up a little bit by year's end based upon what other grants and what other revenue gets recorded. We've got one more billing cycle to put into play here for the utilities, and we also have some grants, in particular the MOST grant, which is helping us fund some of the COVID startup costs that may increase our surplus a bit. Now, most of the surplus is made of increased revenue and savings, with 1.7 million coming from investment income. And council in not the last council meeting, but the council meeting before, saw the report coming back on our investments and how good we are doing on very secure investments and the revenue that it's generating. So we may be under realizing a bit of money there. But we feel that this is a conservative approach to the budget for 1.7 of increased investment income coming forward from forming part of that $5 million surplus. About 1.5 million of savings is from salaries, benefits, and training. Because of COVID, as council knows, we did lay off a substantial portion of our staff for an extended period of time. The rec center was shut down basically from March until early September. And we had skeletal crews working in that facility for over that period of time. And we were also generating revenue with the testing center being there. So that was one of our biggest savings. As well, training has really diminished. People have not been, and employees have not been able to do the training plans that they had targeted as part of the budget of 2020. And that's being a realization of savings of about $200,000 within that framework. The other area of savings was about 1.7 million in savings from contracted services, and this includes legal, consultants, it includes janitorial service, it includes landscaping services, snow removal services, so a whole catch-all of different contracted services that, because of COVID, it impacted this line item as well, and we're seeing about $1.7 million worth of savings within that contracted service. Because of that, too, $160,000 in savings in materials and supplies, and then about $150,000 in public relations and communications. And this is all, the majority of this, I would almost, it's hard to track exactly, but probably 95 to 97% is all due to COVID, impacts of COVID. Like I said, by year end, it could be higher once all our revenue and grants are recorded. And this is a great opportunity to have this conversation. Having this kind of surplus gives us the ability to have this conversation about how to stop the diversion with a minimal impact to the taxpayer. Now, some people want to say, well, surplus, is it a good thing? Surpluses are a good thing in some respects, but at the same time, they're a flag. They're kind of a red flag for a couple of things. One, within the public sector, it becomes a concern for having large surpluses. It becomes an issue of overtaxation. It becomes an issue of over-optimism. It becomes an issue of planning for too much contingency from that perspective on things breaking. And we have to get to a realistic level within our operational budget, especially the general side, to be more accurate on our taxation rates and our taxation levels for our community. And so I think, well, there is a good level of surplus. Having anything above $100,000, I think, would be very, very concerning. And the closer we get to zero from our budget and our projections, the better we are and the better our taxpayers sit from that perspective. And that we need to take that into consideration. And so those are the types of things we have to deal with. Now, I need to also caution council too. One thing that's not in this framework is the future asset management costs associated with replacement of all our assets. Now, that's going to be a big, scary number. And like I've said through this whole budget process, and we've stressed through this whole budget process, we're not going to fix everything all at once. And it's going to take a long period of time and to get our assets back to being renewed. And by the time we get that finished, we'll be starting all over again. So it's just this big circle that we keep going around and around and around on from that perspective. So with that surplus, it gives us that great opportunity to move on and talk about kind of our expenses in our utility structures from that perspective. Our utilities are doing quite well when it comes to revenues. And we haven't figured in the potential increase in revenue from any new agreements for outside our boundaries, but we're doing quite well. And this graph kind of shows what is being transferred into utility reserves, as well as what diversion is going directly into general operating and to the SURF funding as well. So this kind of table shows that about $2.4 million, 2.415 is heading into the general fund, and that's being split between the SURF fund and general operating from that perspective. And in the meantime, we're still contributing about $2 million to utility reserves and keeping those healthy and allowing us to continue doing work. Now, the utility diversion that we're proposing before you, and let me be clear, there is a whole host of options. This surplus gives us a whole range of options to actually deal with this diversion. So what we are proposing from an administrative perspective is we terminate in 2021. We use the surplus to set up a tax stabilization fund to ease the impact of the diversion. And we use the utility diversion. The use of the utility diversion to fund general capital ceases in 2021 as well. So that $1 million that was part of the budget that was slated to go into SURF goes back to utilities and split between water and sewer utility. Now, council can select a tax rate scenario to support the diversion to lengthen the use of this tax stabilization fund, and then switch that to general cap reserve if they want to in the future. But it's not necessary in the first year in particular. as we start this process. We want to make sure that we have all the information and we have a clear understanding of exactly how this diversion is being used within our operating fund, so that we can move forward. So a tax increase is not necessary. We would certainly like that to have some certainty and surety moving forward, but it is something that we need to, that council will need to make a decision upon before we adopt the final budget. Another key piece of this proposal is water and sewer projects would have to fund the road rehab when replaced. So 4th Avenue, for example, when you are, and we've talked about this previously, when we are just replacing the road and the main driver is replacing the sewer and water mains underground, and there's no expansion or no new road infrastructure being built, the utility should actually be funding that road rehabilitation. And so if that asphalt was not the primary reason why we're starting that project, then it should be coming from the water and sewer projects. Now, most of those road rehab projects have been funded from grants, so gas tax or MSI. What that does is allows us to free up that grant funding to build new infrastructure. So new buildings, new roads, new pathways, new playgrounds, whatever it may be. But it frees up that funding to give us, to add value in other sectors instead of just teaming up with a water and sewer project. Part of this package also means that we need to take a look at our reserve policy and structure to simplify it. And we move from kind of a multitude of 33 different reserve funds down to 14 with internally restricted funds for different purposes. We also need to take a look at our surplus policy and have a clearly defined policy about how the surplus is going to be used. And if you take a look, I'll show you the next on a table coming up. But over the last 3 years, we've had almost an $8 million surplus that has gone back into various capital funds. But having a clearly defined surplus policy, where that gets allocated and how that gets used to stabilize taxes is kind of a key piece from that perspective. I think we still need to continue finding operational cost savings and efficiencies through service level reviews by division. And I'm sure that there's additional funding that we could find through that process. And of course, asset management and our utility fee structure needs to be fully reviewed as we move forward with this as well. One of the things that we're taking a look at as part of this proposal is that ensuring that all our staff costs are properly distributed according to the utilities. And so there is some cost savings there that could be or not cost savings, but some costs that could be reallocated to utilities for those staff that are spending a good portion of their time either administratively in utilities or on the ground out in the field in utilities. So that's kind of the proposal that we've kind of put together. We feel that it's a reasonable one. It's a reasonable use of the use of this surplus to get us off the bad habit and move us into a best practice kind of scenario. And it allows us some time to also take a look at our utility rates, our asset management program, and do some of the administrative work that we need to get our policies up to speed and current as well. Now, what that looks like from a funding wise, and this table is probably a little confusing for all. I've tried to simplify it. As a note, all the transfers for 2021 to 2024 would cease with this proposal. So those transfers that you see of almost just over $2 million would cease starting in 2021. And we would use that $5 million to offset the $1.4 million diversion into general operating. What this means is that this allows us to increase our utility reserve transfers. And over the next 4 years, we would be at we would see an increase of about $9.2 million of diversion going back to utilities, which would greatly help our asset management program in the future. We've got some big ticket items on the horizon, including the wastewater treatment plant, the water treatment plant, and all this helps us from a long-term planning perspective, having that funding available. And so, this is really probably a once in a lifetime kind of surplus that we can we can use appropriately and allocate into this diversion to get us off this habit. Right now, as we stand, we're about 3 years in to a 10-year plan, but we still have 8 years left to go before we're entirely off the diversion. So this would speed that up immensely and get us moving in the right direction from that perspective. And this is a great opportunity from that conversation. From a tax perspective, you've seen some of the tax implications scenarios. You know, we think a 1% is appropriate. That would be on the average household, about a $57 increase per household. That generates $200,000 approximately in new revenue that would help offset and keep that fund stable over a longer period of time. And we would propose that we would do that over the next several years, just a 1% dedicated to that tax stabilization fund. Now, in the first year, like I've said, it's not necessary that we do it. I think we can certainly find other options. And there is a multitude of options here that we can come up with to facilitate the ceasing of this diversion. So there's certainly some conversation about how to do that, how to make it stable over time, and how to use that in perpetuity as to keep our tax rates consistent and there's no yo-yoing around from that perspective. We don't want to see big fluctuations in tax rates going from 1s one year to 7s or 8s or 9s the next year. It'd be nice to be consistent between that 1 and 3 kind of range over time. Part of this process too takes a look at our reserve fund structure, and it forced us to take a look at how we do our reserves. We currently have 33 kind of reserve funds set up, and the goal here is to and what I've heard from some members of council is that there's too many, there's confusion, there's lack of clarity, and so the goal here would be to provide that clarity by reducing them from 33 to 14, and then internally restricting them within those funds to dedicated projects. So the first kind of program, we take a look at the SURF fund and we amalgamate that with the capital infrastructure reserve. It's all going to the same purpose of asset renewal and new assets. We would take the general municipal operating reserve fund and amalgamate that with the tax stabilization fund. That would see another, collaborative approach would be directed for making sure this taxes stay stable over a long period of time. And then council would be required to determine if a dedicated tax increase to determine the diversion is appropriate to fund that tax stabilization fund in the future. Once we collapse that, and there's a sheet, I'll go through a table after this kind of slide about what that reserve structure looks like. And there are 2 new reserve funds proposed that will be internally restricted for allocated funding that's already allocated, so that's protected. But we would have to prepare new reserve policies and structures to reflect that as for surplus and reserves. I think we still could continue to find cost savings and efficiencies, reduce our level of contingency for what ifs, take a look at trend analysis over time, over a 5-year term, to take a look at how many water breaks, how many sewer breaks, and budget according based upon trending. And of course, the revenue neutral approach. Continue to work on our asset management and capital infrastructure replacement plans. That's a key piece to the financial modeling over the next 20 years. And this is going to be a shift, and I don't think council's really seen this, but trying to develop a realistic capital plan for the next 20 years based upon asset management and building it from that perspective to fill out that financial modeling from that perspective. Then we need to prepare for a utility fee structure review. We haven't reviewed it since 2017. So 2022, it's a 5-year cycle, and you'll hear lots about 5-year cycles. And you probably heard lots about those as well. That we take a look at reviewing our utility fee structure in 2022 and making adjustments then from that perspective. And then we get realistic. We adopt a realistic approach to budgeting projects, and we target around the $6 million per annum capital plan on average is our human capacity we have currently without hiring any additional staff to maintain our capital plan. And then we take a look at reviewing our recurring expenses process and determine if it should end or not, and just funnel into that tax stabilization fund for future projects. So what that really looks like, and I did a little bit of work on that, that really takes a look at moving it down into these 14 reserve funds that you see on your screen. MSI, LGFF, which are the provincial funds, we have to keep because that's got to be segregated money and that's allocated from that perspective. Gas tax, same thing. We're under an agreement. It has to be separate. It has to be used for specific purposes and is defined through that agreement. Where we start seeing change, we take our streets and we have some nominal amounts in some of these funds, like our streets fund, $18,000. I think that's a patch, right? That's not very much asphalt at 18 grand. And same with our SIR, we'd amalgamate that with our SURF fund and make that a general capital and asset replacement fund. And within that, we would also have internally restricted the aquatic fund, the fleet vehicle, sale of land, and recreation. Now the recreation, we're proposing that we use it up this year. It's like $4,200. It's a couple of basketball nets or something along those lines that we could purchase and use and then get rid of that funding and delete that internally restricted funds. Then we would create a tax stabilization fund formed primarily from this $5 million surplus, but we'd also move our general operating reserve into here, and our snow maintenance would be internally restricted, as well as our cemetery and our sponsorship would all be internally restricted. Another new fund that we would propose would be the Community Development Reserve, which would take all those FCSS projects, affordable housing, community public art, United Way funding, and CVAC, internally restrict them and create that Community Development Reserve that council can be focused on community-based initiatives across the community and using those fundings from that perspective. Fire would stay the way it is. That's a big ticket item. On the horizon in 2025, we do have a new ladder truck replacement that's kind of on the horizon that we need to start thinking about and having those conversations. And then the rest are all kind of utility-based and offsite levy-based, which we have to keep. That would be the structure that we would propose, and that could streamline it a little bit and then internally restrict within those three core funds, the SURF, tax stabilization, and community development. Council can attach any conditions to the funding within that by resolution and internally restrict from that perspective. So that's kind of that structure. And with the utilities now picking up the cost of asphalt replacement when road, sewer and water main projects are being underway, and go forward from there.
Chris?
Yep.
Can you just remind me what on item 4, the sponsorship reserve is about?
I'll leave that to Leanna. That one still confuses me a bit.
The sponsorship reserve was developed when we originally started building the field house, and we were putting 50% of the sponsorship money that we received every year into that. Currently, we've got 93,000 and change in that sponsorship reserve, and we have no real plan on how we're going to use that.
Yeah, that was part of the BRIC program?
That's correct.
Okay, thank
There's
you.
the bricks and the meeting rooms and the banners.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
So as you can see, we're actually pretty healthy from a reserve perspective. And getting off this diversion, I think, makes us healthier and puts us in a much stronger financial position for the future. So to summarize the utility diversion conversation, and we'll open this up for conversation pretty quickly here. This is just one option. And I think there's a range for council to consider. One, you can keep the status quo and no change in your diversion and maintain the plan to terminate in the next 7 to 8 years. And then just use this surplus to fund reserves and other projects as you deem fit, and what that looks like. You can use the surplus to terminate the diversion and increase taxes by that 1 to 3 to maintain it over a longer period of time, and to build general capital from that perspective, and maintain that as well as that asset management. council can use the surplus to terminate diversion and defer any tax increase and to maintain until 2022 and have a conversation after that, after the first year is done. And you can also kind of terminate and direct us to find costs to maintain this tax stabilization fund over time. As I said throughout this presentation, this forecasted surplus is a one-time opportunity. I don't know if we'll see it again. And it is a great way to soften that blow and speed up the cessation of the diversion. And lots of big words here, right? And from that perspective, it starts building us some flexibility to use some of our grant funding for, those community-based projects, like the aquatic facility, any expansion to the rec center, including a new pool, if that's something that we go down the path of, new park spaces, new playgrounds, new pathways, bike lanes. It allows us to have flexibility from that perspective. And it gives us, by changing the reserve structure a bit, it gives us an improved ability to target contributions through the budget process and outside funding. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that tie it together, and it links it all to the process that we've been going through over the last month. And I think this conversation on the utility diversion is probably the most important piece within this budget process of how to use this surplus. So from here, it's up to council, right? Council can approve this proposal or provide alternative direction or keep the status quo. If they want to go forward with a tax increase, that's your choice as well. What we need to do after this, depending on how you decide, and there's no need for a decision today. This is there for discussion purposes only. Decisions can happen next week or anytime after this point. We don't want to rush any decision-making process on this $5 million. And we want to have surety moving forward that we're making sure that council's fully informed of the use of this surplus. But if we do go forward, we got work to do as well. We need to be developing new reserve policies, new surplus policies, I think we always need to continue to find cost savings and efficiencies. It never stops. We need to take a look and reduce the level of contingency within our budget as well. And instead of planning for what ifs and that it's going to break, take a look at what our trend analysis is showing. And then and you've heard this approach as well, we need to be realistic when it comes to our projects and what we plan to achieve. Without that realistic approach, we'll continue to have surpluses that become the conversation about overtaxation over a longer period of time. So for that's kind of the end of the presentation and the conversation. I open that up for questions, comments, or concerns. And would be glad to have myself or the rest of my team that's on the call, including Leanna, Riley, or Nicole, take any questions.
I'll start, I guess. I love where you're taking this, Chris. I think it's fantastic, and you're right. It is a one-time opportunity to be able to do this, and I support it 100%. My question is finishing this diversion in 2021, you're estimating a 1 to 3% tax increase to maintain this. I've got a bit of an issue I'm struggling with doing tax increases to support this with it being kind of a mix-up or a mistake or bad business practice, whatever you want to call it, that we've been doing since 09, 10, whatever it is. We shouldn't have been doing this, but things happen, and it happened. I just feel like doing it quickly but needing a tax increase to support doing it quickly is almost like a penalty to the community for the town doing this. I don't know. I'm struggling with. Give me your thoughts on my rambling. I'm getting good at bad ramblings.
Mayor Snodgrass, you're right. At the end of the day, we could probably support this with no tax increase, and then have the conversation in 2022 again about supporting this tax stabilization fund and what that looks like. that gives us a year to find more cost savings. And if we can find more cost savings, that's a good thing. And that may offset a 1% tax increase is $200,000 of revenue. That's not very much to find, right?
Yeah.
And so I think if council's supportive of the concept of using this $5 million to cease this diversion, we can always have the conversation about tax increases later to support the tax stabilization fund. And it gives us a year to find $200,000 of savings within the general operating fund.
Okay, thank you. That's kind of where I'm at with it. Thanks, Chris. Now, I don't have anybody on my list putting their hand up or anything.
I am.
Carol, go ahead.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thanks for your presentation, Chris. Going back to your chart with all of the reserves, why is the fleet vehicle reserve being deleted?
It's being amalgamated and internally restricted. Let me just go back. Where is it? Actually, no, sorry. You're right. Deleted. It's, I think there's a different structure that we need to explore. And it's something that we haven't really discussed at all. And it's about self-funding fleet vehicles. Currently, we need to take a look at that structure and see if that will actually work for the organization. We are spending well above that on an annual basis that just comes out of general taxation. So it's not really a self-funded fund per se. And it's, I think next year we've got slated some $500,000 of vehicles, $537,000 of vehicles in the capital plan from that perspective that would zero out this fund in the future. But I do think there's a structure we need to take a look at about how to create a self-funding fleet program that is self-sustaining over time from that perspective. And so this, one pickup truck is $60,000. So that's the challenge that we face. But council can certainly still internally restrict it if the fleet vehicles are important. Instead of deleting it, you can certainly internally restrict it within that general capital and asset replacement perspective.
And I guess I'm just having a hard time getting my head around, well, I guess two things: reducing the level of contingency for what ifs. Isn't it important to have some money around for a rainy day just in case something happens? And then kind of connected to that same concept is I'm having a hard time. I just need clarity on why a surplus is viewed as a bad thing.
A surplus, in local government, a surplus, if you get too high of a surplus, it becomes a conversation of overtaxation and under delivery. So at the end of the day, if you get too high of a number, and I would kind of ponder a guess that anything over $100,000 is probably getting into that overtaxation perspective or under delivery perspective. The closer you are to zero, the better you are. And if you're doing budgeting well within the local government framework, you're looking at your trend analysis over time and taking, I've seen communities budget for a bad example. I'm going to use a bad example here, right? 20 water main breaks a year, right? They budget for 20 water main breaks a year, but really their trend only shows them that they're only repairing 5 a year from that perspective, but they're always budgeting for 20. That is over taxation, right? You're planning for way too many what ifs. So let's get to it. I'm not saying that we zero out all our what ifs, Councillor McMillan. It's about getting to a realistic level and taking a look at what have been the issues over a period of time that allows us to budget appropriately. So taking a look at trend analysis and saying, okay, how many water breaks have we had on average each year? Oh, it's been 5. We're going to budget for 6 instead of 15, right? And getting more realistic from that perspective.
And one last question, just for clarity around the sponsorship of that money at $93,000. Like, it's that money. Like, I know people mentioned about bricks, but I guess I just want clarity about, isn't that money supposed to be directly for the field house then, or I guess I'm confused about that one.
It is. Oh, go ahead, Leanna.
Normally, we should be putting that back to the field house and or the recreation complex. We haven't really had clear direction from council of where we want to be spending that money. So we've basically just held it in a reserve. And if something were to come up, that's when we would have come back to council saying, okay, we'd like to have a budget amendment for X, but we want to fund this from the sponsorship reserve. And because we don't have anything that since we started, when we built the field house, and I believe that was 2012, 2013, when we started that, we actually have ceased putting money into the sponsorship reserve because according to our restricted surplus policy, we are to have it under, I believe, $100,000 to sponsorship reserve.
Okay, thank you very much, Leanna, for clarifying that. And thank you, Chris, for answering my questions.
Thank you for asking questions, Carol. I appreciate being tested.
Yeah, I think I'll just say something on your question about the surpluses. And I think municipalities, well, any level of government has to be very, very careful because it's easy for us to budget and err on the side of safety because all we have to do is increase taxes. It's a very easy thing to do. And I like the way Chris is doing this where, you know, maybe we've been a little bit not as quite as tight as we could be and making it easy for everybody that we have a little bigger safety buffer there. So we just got to be really careful with it. And I think you've done a great job, Chris, in challenging everybody and continuing to get us just to tighten things up a little bit more so we don't get into overtaxation for sure. Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor Snodgrass. Chris, I have to echo that this is brilliant, and it takes somebody like you to devise a program like this. I'm very, very, very impressed. Going back to the cause of this thing that began it all is when in 2010, when we had our utility rate increases, it was caused by a real inequity in our utility revenues from people. People were basically all paying the same no matter what type of water they were using. And we only had one flat rate for sewer. So the premise of us raising utilities was that it would no longer be subsidized from taxes and that it would be more equitable and fair over the whole population. We raised the utilities to cover not only the costs, but ongoing capital programs. And that the money that was over and above what was needed for the basic operation expenses went to the future costs of replacing infrastructure, etc. So my question then is that it didn't come out that extra costs went directly to those reserve accounts and then to take the excess money that we need and not put it in our revenue accounts in the operating budget, but just go directly to reserves.
For accounting practices, we have to recognize the revenue and then we can transfer it to a reserve. We can't just net the revenue off. So instead of recording $100 in revenue in water and transferring 50 of it to reserves, we actually have to show $100 in revenue, and then hopefully we have $100 in expenses to make it self-supported. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but in coming to a surplus at the bottom, we have excess revenue that isn't offset by expenses. So that gives us a surplus kind of in the budget, in the operating budget, which is not really a surplus. It's a surplus of revenue over expenses, but it's needed revenue for all the pipes and the facilities and structures that we need to deliver those utilities. So,
For best practices, we should be transferring to show a revenue neutral, or basically whatever your revenue is, you should have your expenses. Even if the change is just a transfer to reserves to support our future on replacement of some of our assets within our water and sewer utilities.
okay. So I was having a hard time figuring out how we could have had a surplus in 2020 with the COVID extra expenses and the lower revenues we received. But realizing that it's some very good moves by Chris and the team to cut a lot of the expenses off of that proposed budget that put us in this position. And that was with a 0% tax increase last year for the 2020 budget. So my fear is that we've cut a lot of areas that needed cutting, and in the few years leading up to this, we have streamlined our services and taken advantage of technological things like our garbage pickup and the water meters, all the extra stuff that we put in to make it more efficient and implement cost savings. So I'm just kind of thinking that there isn't a great deal of room for future cost cuttings. And then in the longer term, we are considering a revenue from outside sources on water and some wastewater. So those could not continue in the future. We don't know. So if we don't have the areas where we can either save money or continue with the revenue stream that we have now, it could be a problem somewhere down the road.
I can answer that. Yeah, Councillor Moore, you're correct. That revenue stream, even though we have an agreement, it is a 5-year agreement. Now, if those revenue streams decide, or those users decide to terminate outside our boundaries, the use of our utilities, sewer and water, we will see a degree, I wouldn't say a full cost recovery, but a degree of reduced expenses associated with delivering that water. Now, what that is, I don't want to guess on what that cost savings may be. Will it be the same rate that we're generating revenue? Probably not even close to that. And so, yes, that could crimp our future in 5 years' time if we don't have an ongoing agreement in place. That could cause us some transfers to reserve kind of fundamentals of loss of that revenue. that is a significant piece of the revenue. And if we do lose it, and that could be outside our control if we lose it or not, that will be another kind of hurdle that we have to figure out how we solve that problem. But I think the healthier we get our reserves over the next 5 years before this agreement is executed with the county, the better position we are going to be. And knowing how quickly water and sewer takes for an approval process, we might very well be kind of in that 10-year kind of scenario as well. So, there is certainly some risk, a degree of risk with the loss of that revenue, and we shouldn't bank on revenue outside our boundaries. That's I think part of the issue financially here is that there's realized that there's been a significant amount of revenue realized from outside our boundaries with low cost to deliver, and it's been providing an additional source of funding from that perspective. And I think we need to be careful and not take that for granted. It's much like MSI grant as well, right? My philosophy when it comes to budgeting, you never budget for grants. When you budget for grants, then you just get disappointed over time. And so when we are fearing that, some of the letters that we're seeing from the provinces, the MSI is probably changing and may be reduced. This may be the same for that revenue that we see from the Cargills and the county as well, that may impact our reserve accounts and our future capital plans when it comes to water and sewer in particular. That's a significant piece of revenue from that perspective. But we've done our best to try and mitigate that. And, this $5 million, like I say, we wouldn't be having this conversation if we didn't have this surplus coming forward. We would still be sticking with the status quo and trying to deal with this. And this is that one-time opportunity that we can use to our advantage, be it either keep it for the status quo and keep the status quo with the diversion taking place, and put this $5 million away into a rainy day kind of tax stabilization fund in perpetuity, or use it to get off the diversion and then figure out if there are some more cost savings within the budget. I do see that there are some more cost savings within the budget. And I think there's, some time spent just having conversations, which have been difficult under COVID, to have conversations with everybody. And always asking the question, why do we do it this way? How about this way? And always questioning how we do things. And I don't think that ever ends. We should never stop questioning how we do things and how we can do things better, nor should we ever stop adjusting our levels of service and finding out where the sweet spots are, so to speak, on that level of service spectrum, where we can reduce before people notice, and then back up, and what levels of service that people expect really high levels of service, snow removal being one of them. Where's our sliding scale? Landscaping being another one. So I think there's all sorts of strategies we can employ to find some dollars to reallocate or to fund the 1% that we talked about on the tax increase aspect of things. There's all sorts of options out there, but you're right. There is, in 5 years, if the county agrees to the new agreement, in 5 years, if they decide to terminate it and they have their long-term water source coming from the bow built by that time, that may be a significant loss of revenue for us, and we'll have to adapt to it at that point in time.
Also, Chris, I know you're doing just a fantastic job with all of this cost cutting and stuff. You came up with money that I didn't think you'd be able to admit COVID. And thank you very much for that. The investment revenue is not a continuing thing either. And investments are actually tied to the grants that are going to either have to be returned or used eventually. So we can't bank on MSI investment revenue and possibly utility revenues. Our revenue streams are going to be down, and there could be new sources of revenue or not, depending on the continuing climate of our province, our town, all the atmospheres around us as well.
Yes, certainly that we're certainly affected by so many outside sources, be it COVID, be it the province, be it the provincial economy, be it the federal economy. And any investments that we may have moving forward, we need to be very careful about that revenue being recorded and only use, and I need to probably use this, I should have used this term earlier. This $5 million surplus is a snapshot in time, right? It's at this point in time, and how this is an opportunity that we can take and use to our advantage to soften the blow of getting off this diversion. And it allows us to do it, way faster and way faster than we anticipated. And it allows us to, shift some philosophies a bit to maybe leverage better funding and steer funding into better directions as well, to allow better use of our resources and more visible projects that have bigger bang for the buck as well. So I think those are all, Don, those are all kind of risks. We haven't really taken a look at the investment income going long term about what that looks like. We've taken this as a snapshot in time that we've generated $1.7 million of investment income that we need to use for something, right? Either we use it as this tax stabilization concept, or we fire directly into reserves for utilities or other entities from that perspective. Because we've got a lot of work yet to do on all our flood infrastructure about asset replacement and ongoing maintenance of that as well, that we don't have the numbers in play from that perspective. And this tax stabilization may help us with the diversion, but over time, if we continue to have some surpluses and we have a good surplus policy that funnels all the money here, we may be able to fund the operating costs associated with our flood works as well by softening the blow. And so we don't, again, it's about using this to our advantage to soften the blow of this diversion, as well as looking at the future about how to use how to use surplus in the future to stabilize tax rates so that they're not big jumps like we've seen across this country, actually. A lot of communities have been fighting this about big jumps and big increases in taxes. We're trying to use that to our advantage to not see that happen. Stay consistent over time, keep it flat, but knowing that our costs go up, our utility rates go up, our labor costs go up, our costs for materials go up. And of course, we always get the municipal pricing cost as well. That always seems to be 10% higher than the private sector. So we have that to deal with. So, but certainly I hear you, there are some risks and there's things that we need to continue monitoring on that investment side of things, and understanding the investment income, and making sure that we're not planning for that in the future, that we only plan for it for today. And use that from a today perspective for mitigating any impacts to our taxpayers. So hope that makes sense. And I hear your concerns, Don. I really do.
I guess boiling it all down to the end result is I didn't really want us to be lulled into a position where we think that we are tremendously secure because we had a surplus of $5 million. And so we just go ahead and say, okay, there'll be a 0% tax increase in 2021, and following a 0% tax increase in 2020. And it's just not realistic to look at doing that on a long-term basis for the long term. It's in 2020, 2010, when we raised utility rates, our argument was that it was being supplemented by taxation. And it will no longer be supplemented by taxation, that it'll be equitable and fair for everybody to pay their fair share. So now, and we had a 0% tax increase in 2010. So I just don't want to be lulled into a position where we say, oh, we should have a 0% tax increase in 2021 because we have a little bit of excess money at this point.
So that's a real valid point, Don. And I think everybody around the table has heard me say this over that zeros are really tax cuts. You know, at the end of the day, you do them for purposes like we face with COVID, and we're still feeling those effects for COVID on our residents. But in realistic terms, for the long term, there has to be a consistent level of tax increases each and every year to fund operations. And we haven't even gotten into the conversation about the full cost recovery of asset management yet. And that's a big, you know, I don't want to scare everybody around the table, right? Because that's a scary number. And you know, when you throw $600 million of new assets that have to be replaced over a period of 20 years, you know, how do you fund that? But nobody needs to panic from that perspective, because at the end of the day, too, you know, we've got to do our work in-house here to understand all the condition of our assets so that we can figure out strategies how to extend their life. It's a whole integrated process, and this is just one snapshot in time that we have an opportunity to do something, and I believe it sets us up for the future quite well. And we've got to mitigate those risks as best we can that you've identified, the loss of revenue from the county, the loss of investment income as well, and not always bank on that. And I think, you know, in the future we need to bank on, we need to mitigate the loss of MSI, because I think that's a real possibility. You know, I've said this before, I think we're one of the only jurisdictions in Canada that sees the value of that kind of money coming back to us from the provincial government under MSI. I don't believe, and I have not seen another jurisdiction that has a similar setup like Alberta has. Everybody's name's put in the hat, and you have to compete against everybody for grant funding. And you're lucky some days, and some days you're not so lucky. And having this consistent level, this is, you know, we need to be using it to our advantage and mitigating future impacts with MSI before it's gone. Because I truly believe that it's on the horizon of being entirely eliminated at some point in time.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris.
Kathy?
Thanks very much. And thanks, Chris. I think this is an opportunity we cannot let go. We've talked about this now over the last two terms for a good chunk of those two terms, and having the opportunity to kind of right this situation. I think we need to take full advantage of it. I think we need to just impress upon, you know, if there's people out there listening, the importance and the value of some of the things you're saying. Having a realistic capital 20-year plan is essential. Having those reserves is essential. And I really love that you're looking at the human capacity, because I think, I'm going to speak for myself, but I think there have been times that probably I've made some decisions with not understanding that maybe we lack the human capacity. And I think those are important conversations we need to have. But more importantly, the days of having provincial coffers that we can rely on, the days of waiting for things to get to a point of almost failing are gone. The days of planning for our own future are here. And I think having these reserves and these good plans are exactly how we'll do that. When we look at this actual surplus and the 200,000, I'm kind of the same mindset as Mayor Snodgrass, that our community has kind of been taking this, I'm going to say a hit, whether it's a hit or not, but having to deal with this situation that we've been put in for a number of years. And should we be doing that again? Obviously, would like to know the impacts of that $200,000 that would have to be cut. Also, Chris, and I don't need the answer now, but if we were to say a 1% tax increase to help alleviate this, what kind of time frame? I know somebody, say you put in a tax and you're never going to take it away, but if we were to look at a time frame, what would that look at? I know we were looking at another 7 to 8 years. Is that the same time frame, or would it be shorter?
Could you repeat, Kathy? Councillor Cooey, you were breaking up when you were asking that question, so I didn't get the whole gist.
Sorry, if we were looking at a 1% or 1 to 3% tax increase, if we did support that, what kind of time frame would be looking at? I know or if we were to go status quo, it was 7 to 8 years. Is it the same time frame? Is it shorter?
I think if we're going to take a look at the 1%, we would be taking a look at 1% per year for the next 4 years to help us maintain that fund. That being said, I think there's still work we can do to find some cost savings, as also to realize some additional new opportunities for revenue generation as well. Because I think there are some opportunities that we could generate a little bit of additional revenue that's not tax-based or utility-based. And we'll also get a chance to see how this new agreement with the county, if they agree to it, what the financial impact on that new agreement looks like as well. And, philosophically, we can have the conversation once they sign that new agreement where that revenue should actually go. Should it go directly into reserves, or should it help subsidize operations? I'm of the view that it shouldn't subsidize operations. It should go into reserves, because it's, hearing Councillor Moore's comments about it's uncertain. We shouldn't design our operations based upon revenue that we're getting now that may disappear in the future. And so we need to be making sure that our operating of our water and sewer and all our systems is funded by our tax and our taxpayers, and not rely on those outside sources. So I think if council decided to go with a tax increase, we'd be supporting 1% per year for the next 4 years to maintain that, and that will get us. I think even without the 1%, we're pretty close to getting us off this diversion in its entirety, and I think it's easier to monitor from that perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Chris.
So I don't have anybody. Oh, sorry, Councillor Nychuk.
Thanks, Mayor Snodgrass. Since we brought the discussion up, I just wanted to put my 2 cents in on supporting Chris's and administration's initiative on this. I think this is the right time to correct this, considering what we've had in front of us with this surplus. Good comments by Councillor Moore on not being lulled into a false sense of security on 0%. I don't think any of us are thinking that that's a long-term thing. I think all of us on council are looking at that last year, this year as short-term, considering the environment we're in. And to reiterate Mayor Snodgrass's comment about not taxing I don't want to call it a financial error in how these funds were handled previously, but maybe not the best decision as to how those funds were channeled. But I'd have a hard time putting a increased tax rate out there based on us fixing a internal financial situation. I know it's for the betterment of the community, but I really don't want to put it on the backs of the community at this time to bring this back in line. I'd rather stretch it out over a period of time and find some funds, like you say you think you can, Chris, than to do something like implement a percentage tax increase to help support this. So I hope we can find that. Anyway, just wanted to put the supportive comments on the direction of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So Chris, can you go back to your presentation? I'm trying to get it back up on mine. There we are. And I guess it's page 13, the summary utility diversion page. Oh, that one there.
This one?
No, the summary
is
the one I'm looking for.
Page 12.
There we are. So this just outlines the options that Chris has been talking about, and the one that I mentioned was kind of leaning towards this: use surplus to terminate diversion, bullet point 4. Use surplus to terminate diversion and direct staff to find cost savings to maintain for 2022. And I think I prefer that right now, just to gives us a year to see where this kind of lands and with what Chris can find without, I'm just not into doing any tax increases directly to support this at this time. And I don't think it's something that we absolutely have to nick this year. We can take a buffer there, like what Mike was saying. But I don't know if council has any other, just to provide Chris a little bit of direction. That's the bullet that I would support. Is there any other thoughts on it? Jamie?
Thank you, Mayor Snodgrass. Yeah, I have to concur with your comments that that fourth bullet is the most palatable today, and it does give us that year of grace.
Everybody else on board with that? If you're, I'll just say it, if you're not, then raise your hand and speak to a different option. But if I don't see any hands, that's, and I don't see any hands, so that's the direction that I think we'll send to you, Chris.
Okay.
Does that work?
That will work. We'll make it work.
It's fantastic what you're doing.
Not just me, it's everybody around this table.
I
and in
know,
this
I know. You gotta, everybody's just been flying around here to try to get this dealt with, and everybody's, Ray and Leanna, I know, are working hard, and everybody in finance to get this taken care of. Your leadership, your guidance, that's pushing it all though, Chris, so it's much appreciated. Is there anything else that we need to talk about today, or is this what we needed?
This is the only item we had on the agenda, Mayor Snodgrass.
Okay.
The rest we had a meeting scheduled for the 30th of November to go through all the other items. And we'll have a presentation put together similar to this to guide council through all the decisions that have to be made in order for the final approval of the budget.
Okay. Maybe if we do a good enough job at all this, we'll turn the heat up in this place.
No, that's part of our measures.
I can't feel these things. I'm the coldest human being on the planet to begin with. Okay,
Mike,
so
we just found $20,000 in energy savings. So
yeah, right on, the great reset.
Well, there's
another term ruined. Okay, if there's nothing else, if council doesn't have any other questions, then I'll adjourn this meeting at 2:14, and I'd like council and Chris just to stay on this meeting for a couple of minutes afterwards.